Bonjour, Wachier. This is Bobby Narcisse. I'm Deputy Grand Chief for Anishinaabe Nation. It's my honor and privilege to welcome you all to our first information session regarding the final settlement agreement on child welfare and child welfare reform programming. As you know, that over the past couple of years, Anishinaabe Nation has been engaged in meaningful discussions on looking at ways to revamp and reform the Child and Family Services Program. You will remember that the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal found the federal government guilty against discriminating against your children and First Nations children in the areas of child welfare. As a result of the ruling from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunals, a series of remedies have been ordered by the tribunal. So the parties have been diligently working on establishing a final settlement agreement to really address these particular issues that are pertaining to the child welfare system within First Nations as well. Anishinaabe Nation has sought intervener status in this very important case. The reason being is that the chiefs have mandated the NAN executive to really look at this. How does it look within NAN communities? What does it mean for NAN communities if this FSA was passed? We are bringing to the table a perspective very unique across Anishinaabe Nation, and that's the uniqueness of our remoteness. As you know, that our remoteness has a big crucial key over the discrimination aspect of child welfare within our First Nation communities across Treaty 5 and Treaty 9. And in that is that why the chiefs have mandated the executive through resolution to look at ways for moving ahead. So welcome to this very important information session. Before we really get started, I'd like to ask our elder Stella to open us up with opening prayer. Please, Stella.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I don't know what's wrong with my video. I look really pale. Anyway, good morning. I'm sitting here from Moose Bay First Nation. I'll open in prayer. Naskamak Chamando Magagishagat, Ebechimiliak Nina, Roskichinagastayak, the Matsu. We're not speaking, Ebechibiak, the watches of it. Nagatelamano Dahitaya, Queespugi Nagastaya, Kumanka Bechibangatek, Queeskich Nagastagno Nigan Dekel, Nagatelaman Msue, Hote Eshitaya, Keshimatsia, Queeska Nagastaya, Kumatsuan. Nagatelam Gimse, Kanakamatami, Matsu Nonesta, Kemiska Kik, Milo Matsuan. Nagatelamanaga, Ebejichia, Queeska Nagastaya. Aski, Maganista, Nibi, Egonde Montana, Church of Matria, Weasco get Nagastayak and Higo Kanaga Vegimilia. Nagatelum Nanesta, Msewakan, Kenagachaya cook, Quest, Shehawak, Isko, Napel, Uskat, Washisha, Quest get your Bejibachujuk, Nikan Dekel, get your Nagastayak, Mswakan, Ganaskum de Nomagagishaga, Kshamendo. Nagatelum Kimse, Abijigoto, Gamakanak, Queska, Nestuiro, Gamiskaki, Matsuno, Granaskum de Nanuchka Gisha, Shemenzo, Migach.
Miigwech, Stella, for that opening prayer. And again, I'd like to welcome you all for this first of 4 virtual information sessions that will be hosted by Anishinaabe Nation and Anishinaabe Nation staff with respect to looking at and analyzing and also just taking an opportunity to really look at what the final settlement agreement will entail for Anishinaabe Nation. As you know that we are acting on direction and mandate by chiefs in assembly through resolution 2408, directing the Anishinaabe Nation Executive to strive to the best of its ability to achieve a final settlement agreement on long-term reform of the First Nations Child and Family Services Program without delay. The resolution also goes on to say that the chiefs will only sign an FSA that includes provision for the full implementation of an evidence-based approach, adjusting the First Nations Child and Family Services Program funding to account for the increased costs of remoteness, especially across Anishinaabe Nation territory, and also to ensure that Anishinaabe Nation First Nations have the opportunity to exercise their free, prior, informed consent by reviewing and also approving the final settlement agreement before it's brought to Chiefs of Ontario and AFN assemblies as well. So today is an opportunity to have to start those conversations as well. The FSA was released back in Montreal at the Assembly First Nations. This is an opportunity for chiefs and leaderships and also your technical staff to really take a look at what is actually in the FSA. And our staff, and especially here at Anishinaabe Nation, along with its legal team, will do its best to present what's in the FSA, but also have an opportunity on August 1st to have a more question and answer period where it'll be an open townhouse sort of town hall meeting in terms of looking at your questions. So I'm looking at the schedule of engagement sessions. Today you'll find that we are starting with an information session number 1. Also, so basically we are disseminating all the information today. I know that there's going to be opportunities for questions. We want to have those opportunities on August 1st, because we want you to have an opportunity to really digest the information as well and get perhaps your technical staff as well. So August 1st as well, if we could get that chart back up. August 1st, we are having another Q&A assembly, virtual assembly, starting at 10 a.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Central. So that's an opportunity where you're going to be able to also really answer those, get those questions asked as well. Also on August 19th, we're having another information session, and session number 2. Again, we'll be going through the information as well, looking at different specific areas as well from the final settlement agreement. But also following up from that session number 2 for information, we have another question and answer virtual meeting that's going to happen on August 22nd at 10 a.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Central. And also we want to follow up with a special Chiefs Assembly that is going to be virtual, and that important date is August 28th, 2024 at 10 a.m. Eastern and 9 a.m. Central. So please mark those very important dates in your calendars. And also we'll be available offline as well for any other questions that you may have in moving ahead. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it on to our staff to walk you through the final settlement agreement. And with me, we have our staff online here. We have Miss Kennedy Ling, that's going to be taking us through the FSA along with her legal support. So take it away, Kennedy. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Deputy. Thank you so much, Stella, as well, for opening us up today. So I just want to welcome everyone and thank you all for coming. And I thought I would walk you through our quick agenda before we get started. So David, if you would pull that up for me. Perfect, thank you. So we're going to start with an overview and a bit more of an in-depth detail on the engagement dates and structure of engagements that the deputy just spoke about. So I want to give an overview right now that today we really want to focus on this being an information session. So this is a large agreement with a lot of detail, and we want to give you as much detail as possible, and we want to make sure that you have the time to take that information back, think about it, talk to your advisors and staff about it, and really have the time to sit with it before we answer questions, as those questions may change or arise over the next couple days. So today we're going to just strictly present information. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, or we have a website dedicated to questions on the FSA that you can go to and submit, and we'll answer those questions when we come back on Thursday. So that's the August 1st date the deputy referenced. So I just wanted to let you all know that today isn't a question and answer period, though that will all be done on Thursday. So Megan is going to go into a bit more detail on that. Then we have an information package that's also posted on the website that you all should be able to access. And we're going to go through that and sort of walk you through that information package. So there's an overview in that package and an executive summary, which really does its best to boil down this essentially 100-page agreement to a few pages. And then I will give you what we call a technical presentation on the FSA. So what this presentation does is it highlights a lot of the major aspects of the agreement and gives a bit more technical detail on those sections. We'll then have Deputy Narcisse come back for some closing comments and wrap up, and then Stella will close this off again right before lunch. So without further ado, I may hand it over to Megan Daniel from Faulkner's, and she's going to take you through the NAN engagement dates and structures. And David, if we could get the information package up, please. Perfect, thank you.
Thanks, David. I wonder if you could scroll down to page 5 in the information package, PDF page 5, beginning, oh, you've got it in the perfect spot. So, hello everyone, my name is Megan Daniel. I'm a lawyer who works with Faulkner's LLP, and Faulkner's has been the law firm providing legal support on the negotiations and the underlying case, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal case. It has been myself, it has been a number of lawyers at this firm. It's also been Julian Faulkner, all working on this important work, but I'm the one who's been designated to speak with you today. So I want to take you through the structure of the engagements so that you understand what it is that is available to you in order for you to get fully informed on the final settlement agreement. So the first thing I want to tell you about is the information package. So there is an information package, which I will go through more carefully later on our agenda. But generally inside the package, you're finding your overview memos, your executive summary of the agreement, a technical presentation, and the agreement itself, along with the appendices to the agreement, the full agreement. It's very long, it's very detailed. So we could give you a number of supplementary materials, just trying to break down that detail and really get to the information that you actually need, which is the pros and the cons and the big parts of this agreement, so that you can make an informed decision about what you want to do in terms of accepting this agreement. So this information package can be found on the NAN website. Also on the website, you're going to find the information around the information sessions. The schedule is up there, the links are up there, it's all nicely laid out. So today is our first information session, July 29th. We'll be spending, as Kennedy said, this time just basically talking at you, but trying to outline the engagements, the terms of the agreement, all of the necessary information. On Thursday, we've got our first question and answer period. And I want to explain the structure of these engagement sessions. The way we're doing this is that we want you to have all the information we can possibly give you And then we want you to have time to sit with that information, to think it over, to deliberate, to talk to the people you need to talk to. And then you can come back, and surely questions will arise during that period. You can bring them to us on Thursday, and we will sit down and we will discuss all those questions and those pros and those cons as frankly as we can. On August 19th, we're going to repeat this again. We need everybody to have an opportunity to have an information session and to have a follow-up question and answer period. So you'll find the same on the same website, you'll find the links to the second information session and to the second town hall with the question and answer period. At these information sessions, so today and August 19th, the 2 information sessions, you're going to find the NAN leadership, the technicians, and us lawyers all present, speaking to the terms of the final settlement agreement. At the question and answer period, we're going to have the same people present to answer any questions that come up or stemming from your discussions afterward. Also, we want you to know that the information sessions, including today, will be recorded and the videos will be posted online. So, of course, not everybody's going to be available at this precise time. We need this to be as accessible as possible. So you'll be able to stream this at any time. You can stream it in a big group in your community with a projector and a screen. We want you to have the information. Finally, this information is meant to prepare you, obviously, for a vote. The vote is going to take place on August 28th at a virtual special chiefs assembly. And I'm going to say more about the process of voting and what this information review and vote is about. But mark that date down because that's the important day, the August 28th day. I'd like to just mention at this time, this information package and these information sessions are not the only information you're going to receive about this agreement. Because NAN is one of the parties to the agreement, they must review and vote and decide on the final settlement agreement. But NAN is not the only party to the agreement. And the parties are the parties that are part of the case before the Human Rights Tribunal. So you've got NAN, you've got COO, and you've got AFN. And because of the way NAN chiefs are situated as members of all 3 of those bodies will be sending you information, having question and answers, sending you information packages, all of the above, and also asking you to vote on the final settlement agreement. And so what you're going to see is that you're going to get bombarded a little bit with information and asked to vote 3 times. And we're going to talk about that more in this information session, to talk about why you need to vote 3 times and why it's so important to show up all 3 times for those votes. So I just want to thank you for your attention to this part of it. You've got the structure of the engagement sessions, and I'm going to turn it back over to Kennedy.
Perfect. Thanks, Megan. And then we are going to move to just the overview of the information package. So if David, you want to scroll up to the top, Megan's going to just take us through the opening, the overview, and the executive summary we discussed. Do you need it to be unmuted, Megan? Could we get Megan unmuted, please? Oh, there you go. Oh, no, you need to be unmuted still.
Sorry about that. Thank you.
Thanks.
So first, I'm going to go through the contents of the information package. First document, overview. It says in brackets around this, read this first. It explains the information package. The second document is the memo, which is a summary of the final agreement, a high-level summary. The third document is the presentation, the technical presentation, which gives you all of the details. The fourth document is the final settlement agreement, the full 100 pages with all the appendices. So you've got those 4 documents in the information package, and I'm going to start with the overview to the information package, the one headed, read this first. What it outlines in brief is, first of all, the history that's led us to having to make this vote. So in 2007, AFN and the Caring Society file a case at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal regarding the discrimination within the provision of child welfare to First Nations children. In 2016, many years later, the case has progressed to the point where the tribunal has found that Canada discriminated against First Nations children through the First Nations Child and Family Services Program, through the 1965 agreement, and through Jordan's Principle. That was in January of 2016. By May of 2016, NAN has made a motion to intervene on the case. And this means that they have now joined the parties, and they are going to address certain aspects of the case. Specifically, they wanted to be a voice on the issues related to remoteness. 8 years later, now in 2024, we have seen these parties, the AFN, the Caring Society, NAN, Chiefs of Ontario and Canada, working together. And now what we have on July 10th, as Deputy mentioned, July 10th, 2024, a final agreement on the long-term reform of the First Nations Child and Family Services Program was reached. So we're talking about this as the final settlement agreement. But that's a bit confusing because we're also asking you to vote and decide on something that we're calling final. The reason is this: reaching an agreement amongst these parties doesn't actually mean the process concluded. What it means is that the negotiation team, the technicians, and the legal counsel work together to make an agreement. And it was the legal counsel, on instructions from our clients, who sign off on what we call the final settlement agreement as an agreement that we can support and recommend. But the decision is for the leadership, for the chiefs of Anishinaabe Nation. And so it's now their job to review this agreement and decide if this is what they want to actually have as the final settlement agreement, the thing that concludes the case. So that's why I was saying earlier, all parties to this negotiation must review and decide on the agreement. So that means you're going to have to do that as a chief of NAM, as a chief within COO, and as a chief within AFM. Could you scroll down to page 5 for me, David? Thank you. So if the FSA is approved by the parties, a motion will be brought to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal asking that the tribunal approve the final settlement agreement. It's only after that approval that the final settlement agreement will be implemented. So this is why we're informing you about this. This is your moment to review and decide on whether or not the final settlement agreement is something that you want to have implemented in your communities. So we're going to move on to the second document in the information package, which is the high-level summary of the final agreement. So this document is intended to give you a general bird's eye view of the agreement. I wanted you to be able to get an idea of all of the parts and know how they fit together, but not have at the same time all of the detail, because it is an extraordinary amount of detail. And I find when I'm trying to review and understand something, having a general picture first and then going into the detail is a lot easier. And so the first part of this document explains the negotiations of the agreement, the history of how we got to where we have a final settlement agreement. And it goes through, as you may remember, the agreement in principle, when it was decided that the negotiations would occur, and how the negotiations would progress, and how the chiefs would be informed, and the mandate from the chiefs, and then up to July when we get Canada gets its mandate, and then we have the final settlement agreement finalized as between the negotiation teams. So that first section is just talking about the negotiations, so you understand the relevant dates and how we came to this particular moment. The second thing we get into is the purpose of the agreement. So the case, as I said, found discrimination in several areas. This agreement only reforms the First Nations Child and Family Services Program. It doesn't address Jordan's Principle. It doesn't address the compensation provisions. These things are addressed in other agreements and at a different time. Right now, we're just talking about the program and eliminating the discrimination found in relation to this program. The third section, as we go down, is the total amount in the agreement. An important fact, this agreement commits $47.8 billion over the next 10 years to implement the program. It's an extraordinary amount of money, but it's important to note this money is not, as I said, related to the compensation. You've heard numbers around the compensation agreement that was approved in 2023. These are two different sums of money. This money is only to implement the reformed program, and the final amount is $47.8 billion. So that's section 3 of the high level summary. If we could move on a little bit, David, thank you. Right up front, we wanted to put out the remoteness provisions because this is NAN's contribution and this is NAN's concern. As you well know, and I don't have to say it, $1 in NAN territory is not $1 down south. And NAN's intervention was primarily on trying to figure out a scientific method using First Nations-led methodology to try to figure out what is the adjustment that has to be made to that Southern dollar so that it's fair in terms of the way the money can be spent and used in the North. And so what we came up with the Northern Adjustment Funding, the RQ adjustments, based on the remoteness quotient adjustment factor methodology. Really what this means is that you need to, you need to come down to the numbers. And so after we apply the remoteness quotient adjustment factor, the RQAF, what you see is a remoteness adjustment of 30% across the nation. And in NAN territory, an average adjustment of 101%. That's extremely significant in terms of how what would have been an equal amount of money per First Nation is now being adjusted to reflect the difficulty of program implementation in the North to the tune of an average of 101% in NAN territory. We'll come back to the remoteness factors later in the technical presentation, but you have an overview, high-level summary there. The next thing that you need to understand about the final settlement agreement. Generally, the funding mechanisms that you're going to find within it are aimed at flexibility. And so what that means is that the negotiating parties had an eye to thinking about things like moving funding across expenditure categories, moving funding that's unused in one year forward to the following year. We didn't want money tied down so tightly because that makes things very difficult in terms of flexibility, and it's not a good way to do things. And the program is supposed to eliminate discrimination and make sweeping reforms quickly, and so that flexibility can be a critical factor in that. The next section outlines all of the different elements of the funding approach. And so the components of funding, I guess, is a better way to put that. So what we're talking about is a 10-year funding framework. And within that 10-year funding framework, there are a number of areas where funding is changing, increasing, being delivered in a different way. And so I'm going to go through these again at the highest level, and we're going to repeat them again in the technical presentation. So obviously the first funding component is baseline funding for agencies. And so that's, agency costs for operations, protection services, maintenance of children and care. Everything goes under that baseline funding. In addition to the baseline funding, we have prevention dollars. And so this funding is for all those prevention services that are supposed to support the children and their families, promote their well-being, and prevent contact with the welfare system. So in Ontario, this prevention funding will be allocated entirely to First Nations, unless a First Nation and its agency come to another agreement, which is entirely up to that First Nation. The third category is the First Nation representative services, also called BandRep more commonly. And this is for supporting the representatives of a First Nation in addressing matters related to the delivery of services. And so those band reps are already operating in many communities. Until March 31st, 2025, those band reps are funded in actuals. After April 1st, 2025, the First Nations in Ontario are provided with the highest annual funding between 2019 and 2022, 2023. And after that, the funding is adjusted for inflation and population growth. The next area is the post-majority support services. That's the funding that's provided for First Nations for post-majority support services. So any youth that's aging out of care, young adults formerly in care up to their 26th birthday, or the age of majority in the applicable legislation. So whatever it says in the act, whatever age is greater. If there's an act that supersedes or 26, whatever is greater. The next is the capital funding, and that's the funding that's provided for capital infrastructure related to or to support the delivery of programming. Moving down to the next page, the next is household supports. And so this is funding that is going to meet the basic needs of family, keeping them together and keeping them hopefully out of care. That funding is being provided to the First Nations, and it amounts to about 25.5 million in 2024, 2025, and it will be adjusted for inflation in each fiscal year. The next area is information technology. So this funding is to support the IT needs, and it's calculated at 6% of the baseline funding and goes to First Nations. And then we've got results funding, and that's the performance measurement framework. And so it's all of those indicators which let you know how First Nations well-being is faring. And that's 5% of the annual baseline funding. You've got a pot of money for emergency funding. So any unanticipated circumstance affecting the provision of services, there's money for that, and that's 2% of annual baseline funding. You've got housing. That's $2 billion over 5 years to support housing, renovation, construction, purchase, related to preventing children from being taken into care and reuniting families. And then finally, as I said, the remoteness adjustment is applying to many of these areas or components of the funding. And so you see that you have remoteness adjustments on prevention, band rep, post-majority support, household services, IT, and emergency, and the results funding. So moving down, there's a few more areas. Those are the major funding components, but there's a few more areas to understand in general about the agreement and what it covers. One of those areas is a changing role between the agencies and the First Nations. There's some changes here. And I'm going to give just a few examples of this. One of them is that First Nations agencies and the accountability to the First Nations they serve is one of the fundamental principles of the final settlement agreement. And so there's a number of provisions in there aimed at improving accountability, such as that agents have to develop a child and community well-being plan with the First Nations. Agencies have to collect data and report to the First Nations on community well-being indicators. Many of these things will have already been done. These maybe aren't changes across the board, but now they're implemented uniformly. And then we have, as a component of the agreement, an eye towards ongoing reform. And so in nobody's mind is the First Nations Child and Family Services Program going to be reformed in one go. And in nobody's mind does it happen, and then we turn our minds and our eyes to other things. Instead, what we have is a reform implementation committee. So this is consisting of members that are appointed by the parties. And what they do is they oversee, they monitor, and they make recommendations on the implementation of the program. NAN has 3 seats on this committee. The committee is supposed to conduct 2 program assessments. One is going to be in 5 years, and the other one is closer to the end of the 10-year term. And what the assessments do is they review and they look at the program's progress towards the elimination of discrimination. In addition to this committee tasked with reviewing the program twice and keeping their eye and making these recommendations, you have further reform measures in place. We have a national secretariat, which is the hub for data collection and dissemination of that information. You've got the Remoteness Secretariat, which is the hub for remoteness research data, and again, dissemination of best practices. You've got the NARC Canada Remoteness Table, which NAN has a voice at that table, addressing remoteness issues at a national level. You've got the NAN Canada RQ table, which is a NAN specific process. And you've got the 1965 agreement reform, which is negotiations yet to come, more things to negotiate, as that 1965 agreement also was found to have discrimination and needs to be revised. Finally, you've got a dispute resolution mechanism. So within the agreement is the creation of a dispute resolution tribunal. This tribunal is supposed to resolve disputes amongst the parties related to the implementation of the agreement. So if the Reform Implementation Committee makes a recommendation, there's the opportunity, and Canada doesn't implement that recommendation, I should say, there's the opportunity that a party could take that dispute to the Dispute Resolution Tribunal and still have an eye of fairness to adjudicate disagreements between the parties. And so that's built right into the agreement. So the next part of this is the technical presentation. Kennedy, I wonder if I should turn that over for you to begin the presentation.
Sure, yeah. I see we have a few more people who've joined. So maybe I'll just reiterate now for everyone who's new that we're going to go through this technical presentation and we're going to answer any questions you have about it on Thursday. So if any questions come up while we're speaking, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will take note of them and answer them on Thursday. Perfect. So we'll get started. David, if you could scroll down to our first slide. Great. So we wanted to open up by speaking again about what we were mandated to do by the NAN leadership. So the deputy spoke about this morning. So in February, the NAN Chiefs and Assembly passed a resolution directing the NAN executive to conclude and achieve a final settlement agreement of the FNCFS program, so the First Nations Child and Family Services program, without delay. It also ordered the NAN executive that they could only sign off on an agreement that included a provision for the full implementation of an evidence-based approach to adjusting funding to account for remoteness. So Megan went over a high-level overview of the remoteness in the summary, and we'll speak more technically about what the evidence-based approach to remoteness is in the agreement. Finally, the NAN leadership mandated that NAN First Nations must have the opportunity to review and approve the agreement before it is brought to the regional and national assemblies for approval. So this is due to NAN's unique party status. And as Megan spoke to before, that's where that need to having to vote 3 times comes in. And that will be why you'd be getting information from 3 different parties to the agreement, because as leadership, you belong to all of these 3 levels of organizations. So that leads us to our next slide, which is that this is all part of a long conversation. So we just passed the AFN Annual General Assembly in Montreal. And now, so over the course of July and August and the first half of September, there will be NAN, COO, and AFN engagements on the FSA. So you heard from the deputy and from Megan about our engagement schedule here at NAN, culminating in an August 28th virtual Special Chiefs Assembly. COO will also be doing various virtual and in-person engagement sessions over the next number of weeks. Theirs will be culminating in a Special Chiefs Assembly September 10th and 11th virtually. AFN will also be doing the same. They are doing virtual and in-person engagements over the next number of weeks, and that will lead them to the September 17th to 19th SCA in Winnipeg to ratify the agreement. So following all these steps, in fall 2024, if the agreement is approved by all the leadership, then the parties would all jointly bring the agreement to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal and ask for a motion to approve the final settlement agreement, which would then allow it to be implemented. Perfect, thank you. So we wanted to provide a bit of background. So to any chiefs who are on the call, they will recall that we held a special chiefs assembly on May 22nd and 23rd. And during that time, leadership were briefed on the agreement as it stood at that time. They were given a hard copy of the agreement at that time. We also presented a presentation very similar to this one. At that time, Canada did not yet have their final mandate. So what we were presenting was a provisional final settlement agreement. Recently, Canada did receive its final mandate, and this led to a few changes from what the agreement said when the chiefs last saw it in May. So Canada received its new mandate, and counsel for the parties, as Megan said, signed off on the draft agreement that they could support and they could recommend to their clients. So this happened during the AFN AGA. That was the time frame that the council signed off on this agreement. So we want to highlight this, the fact that just because NAN's council signed off on the agreement, it doesn't mean that NAN approved the agreement. This just means that the agreement is something they can recommend to clients and to leadership, so it can now be shared for review and decision-making. So as Megan said, it provides for $47.8 billion over 10 years. It does secure the groundbreaking remoteness adjustments that were embedded in the FSA that was presented to the chiefs in May. However, due to Canada not having its final mandate during that special chiefs assembly, the agreement does include some changes to some sections, and these will be highlighted more below. Perfect. So we just want to sort of clear up what this agreement does and does not do. So there's lots of different moving pieces around this file specifically, but also broadly. And we want to make sure that people aren't getting confused between all the different moving parts. So this agreement does not deal with compensation. The compensation agreement was approved by the AFN Chiefs in Assembly, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, and the federal court in 2023. Recently, the compensation removed child class and removed child family class was approved in federal court as well. But NAN and Chiefs of Ontario are not party to that settlement agreement. So that would be the $23 billion that you would be hearing about in the news. So that's separate from this agreement, and it's being dealt with on a separate track. The agreement is also not about Jordan's principle. So any outstanding orders or litigation going on with Jordan's principle is not dealt with under this settlement agreement. So the AFN and the Caring Society proposed that Jordan's principle reform be negotiated separately from the program. So right now, it's currently being heard in front of the Human Rights Tribunal in a non-compliance motion that was brought by the Caring Society in December. So that is not at all dealt with in this agreement. The agreement is not about asserting jurisdiction through Bill C-92. It only sets a floor for you to do that. So what that means is if you're currently working on creating your law or negotiating a coordination agreement, or you plan on doing so in the future, this agreement doesn't preclude you from doing that. It doesn't interfere in that process. All it does is it makes sure that you can't be offered less than what you would have received under this program from Canada. And finally, this agreement is only about reforming the First Nations Child and Family Services Program to address discrimination. And I'll hand this one over to Megan.
Thanks. So as I said, Anishinaabe Nation joined the CHRT case in 2016. And the purpose was to bring attention to the unique challenges related to remoteness and how best to address them. And as you well know, any remote community continues to face a structural discrimination and a lack of access to services related to their location, their geographic location, and the access that's provided to that community. So what happened in short was that Barnes Management Group, on behalf of NAN, prepared a final report that was filed with the CHRT in 2019. And this was groundbreaking work. And what it created was a method to address the discrimination and that unique challenge faced by remote communities. So a key question in the report is to understand how much funding is needed to provide the same level of child and family services in a remote community as is provided in a non-remote community. That calculation was made in partnership with the people in the communities experiencing that remoteness. And so it's an evidence-based method to index costs to account for remoteness. It's a way to quantify the effect of remoteness, which then informs the funding decisions that are made. And it looks at the importance of how a community factor such as housing and food security and employment affects the well-being of children and the need for services. So what came out of that report was that there was strong evidence that remoteness affected the costs of providing child welfare services. In fact, everybody already well knew. But that it required significant increases in funding relative to non-remote communities. And so as we have here in the presentation, the full implementation of the methodology resulted in a national average of 30% and a NAN-wide average of 101%. It also highlights the challenges that are faced by NAN First Nations and how those challenges are magnified by remoteness. The more remote you are, the more difficult it is to face those challenges. And that the level of funding provided by government is therefore disproportionately low relative to the needs of those communities and to the needs of differently situated communities. And this was a systemic barrier. And this is the first time ever that First Nations cited evidence-based methodology is aimed at overcoming this barrier and estimating those increased costs and adjusting that funding to account for that need. And since this is a groundbreaking work, it actually is terribly exciting. There is, of course, further research that's needed to better understand the additional costs associated with remoteness. But in terms of addressing those systemic barriers that contribute to the increased need for child welfare services, an incredible amount of work has been done and will be implemented through this report.
Great, thanks, Meg. So I thought it may be helpful for everyone just to go over a bit of the background, just to contextualize where we are right now. So this case started a long time ago, but the actual complaint began in 2007. So the Assembly of First Nations and the Caring Society filed a complaint against Canada that alleged they were discriminating against First Nations children. It took 9 years for the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal to issue the decision that Canada was guilty of discriminating against First Nations children, youth, and families on reserve through the way they administered the First Nations Child and Family Services Program, as well as Jordan's Principle, and specifically in Ontario, the 1965 agreement, which we'll talk more in detail about later in the presentation. So following that decision in May of the same year, NAN intervened in the proceedings during the remedy stage. And the reason NAN intervened was to ensure that the unique discrimination that was faced by remote First Nations and First Nations agencies was adequately remedied during this process. So between that time, 2016 to 2021, before negotiations towards a final agreement really began, the tribunal ordered various things against Canada, including to reform the program and the 65 agreement, to interpret Jordan's principle more broadly, and compensate victims of discrimination. So they issued a series of orders to begin the process of ending discrimination. Some of you may recall that in 2021, an agreement in principle was signed. So what that means is essentially the parties to the tribunal signed an agreement that set out how they would negotiate a final agreement. So beginning in 2021, November, so 14 years in court since the original complaint was filed and 5 years after the decision, they began negotiating on essentially how we would get to a final conclusion. So this AIP signed on December 31st. It committed Canada to provide $19.8 billion over 5 years. And that was for the reform of both the program and Jordan's principle. So at this time, Jordan's principle and the program were not separate. It also committed Canada to addressing issues of remoteness funding, supporting Choose Life, and funding the National Assembly of Remote Communities. Finally, what it also did was it committed all the parties to reach a final settlement agreement on reform of the First Nations Child and Family Services Program and Jordan's principle by December 31st, 2022. So during that time, in the new year, following the signing of the AIP, the parties negotiated for a year. They didn't reach a final agreement. All the parties extended their negotiating mandates and wanted to continue on. So during that time, the Caring Society and the AFN proposed negotiating the reform of the First Nations Child and Family Services Program and of Jordan's principle separately. And a reason behind this is that we're waiting on further research on Jordan's principle that's still forthcoming from the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy, who did research on the program as well, which formed the basis of the funding structure you see in the AIP and subsequently in this agreement. So that was a big component of why those two split apart. In August 2023, NAN secured a seat at the 1965 agreement reform table. So like I said, I'll speak more to the 1965 agreement later, but I just want to explain here why we have this in here. So in August of last year, NAN chiefs passed a resolution that mandated the NAN Executive Council to advocate for NAN to have its own seat alongside COO, and not just as a region of COO, for when negotiations on the reform of the 1965 agreement begin. They have not yet begun, but when they do, we have this commitment that NAN will be part of that process. So in October, Canada came back to the parties and accepted the AFN Caring Society proposal to negotiate two separate agreements, one for the program and one for Jordan's principle. When they came back to us with this, they had a deadline to achieving a final agreement. And that deadline was the end of June. So because of this, NAN, along with COO and AFN, proposed a schedule and an agenda for intensive FSA negotiations to try and really reach that goal. Also in December is when the Caring Society filed their non-compliance motion on Jordan's principle in front of the tribunal. So between January and May, NAN, COO, and AFN, along with Canada, intensively negotiated the provisional FSA that was given to the NAN chiefs in May and that you see now. So the parties met almost every week for 4 months to come to this draft. At that time, the Caring Society had stepped aside out of the negotiation structure agreed to in the AIP in order to file their Jordan's Principle motion. In February is when NAN Chiefs passed the resolution that we discussed at the beginning of the presentation, which directed the NAN executive to pursue an FSA without delay. May 2024 is when NAN held a special chiefs assembly, as we discussed above, and allowed leadership the opportunity to review and be informed on the provisional agreement. And finally, in July, Canada received its final mandate, and during the AFN Annual General Assembly in Montreal, NAN, COO, AFN, and Canada finalized the draft agreement for leadership to review. So, just to go over some very high-level effects of the agreement if it were to be approved. So if approved, the draft FSA would increase the annual amount of funding that's provided under. It would improve accountability of agencies to First Nations. It would transition away from any actuals funding processes that are currently available by April 1st, 2025. It would set a groundbreaking new bar to accounting for remoteness. It would set a floor for First Nations who are seeking to assert their inherent jurisdiction. Would secure the gains made since 2016 all the way through to March 31st, 2034. And it would supersede related Human Rights Tribunal orders, and it would settle this part of the case. But to reiterate, if approved, the draft FSA would not settle or supersede the tribunal orders that are related to Jordan's Principle. Those would still remain active as it's not part of this agreement. So we thought we'd go into some detail on the new funding available, as you also saw in the summary above. So for prevention and First Nation representative services, we have some more detailed slides later on. But essentially for prevention, it's calculated by an amount of $2,603.55 per resident on reserve. And if you have a small community where you don't reach a 75% or a $75,000 base, with that per capita amount, you get raised up to ensure that everyone gets $75,000. So that funding is intended to support children and families, promote well-being, and prevent contact with the child welfare system. Will be adjusted annually for inflation, population, and remoteness. So right now it has a partial remoteness adjustment, but the full remoteness quotient adjustment would begin April 1st, 2025, if the agreement were to be approved. So First Nation Representative Services, BANREP, is based on previous actual expenditures per capita rates with that $75,000 base also being the floor. So that's intended to support representatives of First Nations in addressing matters related to the delivery of services to their children, specifically in child welfare contexts. So that funding would be adjusted annually for inflation, population growth, and remoteness. So right now, BANREP funding is not adjusted for remoteness at all. If approved beginning April 1st, there would be a full RQ adjustment on that fund. So post-majority support services will be calculated by a per eligible youth rate, which is based on regional household spending data. So you'll see in the agreement that it says that the parties are still determining the final approach to post-majority support services funding. So the reason is that the parties are working on the best way to ensure we have proper data for youth who have transitioned out of care. We know that it's hard to get those numbers, and we really want to make sure that we have the proper data before we solidify it in the agreement. So that's actively going on right now. The purpose of that funding is to support youth in care who are approaching the age of majority, as well as young adults up to age 26 who have transitioned out of care to help with that transition. So this funding would be adjusted for inflation, population, and remoteness. So again, right now, the funding not adjusted for remoteness. If approved, full remoteness quotient adjustment starting April 1st, 2025. And then here are the top-ups that Megan spoke to during this summary. So we have information technology, results, and emergency funding. All of these funding sources go to First Nations, but the way they're calculated is they're calculated based on that First Nations affiliated agency, their baseline budget. So what happens is you take the baseline budget of an agency, you add 6%, or you figure out what 6% of that baseline budget is, and then that dollar amount is split between the First Nations served by that agency. So information technology, which is used to support IT needs for implementation of the program, is 6% of baseline. Results funding, which is supporting reporting, data gathering, to support the implementation of the program, is 5% of baseline funding. And emergency top-ups, which supports responses to unanticipated circumstances which affect the provision of child and family services, is 1% of baseline funding. I want to clarify that the emergency top-up is not intended at all to replace any other emergency management programs that First Nations have access to. It's simply meant to be supplementary to that. All of these funding streams are adjusted annually for inflation, population, and remoteness. So then we have the household supports funding. So what this funding is meant to do is helping families meet basic needs that, if they go unmet, could lead to children coming into care. And it's calculated based on a First Nations share of the total national population that are living in low-income households on reserve. It is adjusted annually for inflation, population, and remoteness. Then we have capital funding. So capital funding will be available through an application. This is the only application-based funding component in this agreement. And what that capital infrastructure is meant to do that you would be applying for is to support the delivery of programming related to the implementation of this agreement. So prevention programming, protection, band rep, things like that. And then there's an additional amount of funding for housing, which will be going to First Nations. So it's $1.79 billion over 4 years. It was originally $2 billion over 5 years, and the initial amounts were released last year. So that's figured out by taking every First Nation across the country gets a $250,000 base amount. Then you add on a formula which looks at rates of overcrowding, population, and remoteness. And so that funding is split up between First Nations across the country, and it will be sent directly to First Nations. You do not need to apply for it. And its purpose is to support meeting the housing needs of families and try to begin to address the lack of safe and suitable housing for children. So then moving into the funding for the agencies. First, agencies get baseline funding. So this is based on their previous expenditures. And what essentially it is it's costs for operations, protection services, maintaining children in care, and it's adjusted annually for inflation and population growth. Then we have prevention, which will speak to the split of prevention funding in more detail in the next slide. Then the emergency top-up, exact same as the emergency top-up above, 1% of baseline funding 2 agencies adjusted annually for inflation and remoteness. Then again, same thing, capital funding on an application basis. Perfect. So right now, prevention funding is shared between First Nations and their agencies predominantly. So on April 1st, 2025, prevention funding will begin to be fully adjusted for remoteness using the RQ adjustment. So that's number 1. Right now, it only has a partial RQ adjustment. Beginning April 1st, 2025, full RQ adjustment. Between April 1st, 2024 and March 31st, 2026, prevention funding will continue to be shared between First Nations and agencies. So sort of the status quo as it is now. Beginning April 1st, 2026, in Ontario, that split will remain shared as the default. So sort of as the status quo, it will remain the baseline that funding is shared. Outside of Ontario, First Nations will receive all prevention funding as the default, and then they would have to elect to share funding with their agencies. In both cases, First Nations can elect to reallocate their prevention funding in whichever way they like. And this is by giving written notice to ISC. So if a First Nation in Ontario wants to receive all of its prevention funding, it's absolutely entitled to do so. They just submit written notice to Canada and say that they want to redirect all their prevention funding to the First Nation. So this gives First Nations the choice to continue sharing prevention funding with their agencies if they wish to continue receiving prevention services or electing to deliver all prevention services themselves. Moving into band rep funding. So you'll see this called in the agreement First Nation Representative Services. That's the new name. When you see it, it's referring to band rep services funding. You'll also notice, and I want to draw your attention to this to make sure you're looking at the proper clauses in the agreement, that Ontario has an entirely different funding structure for band rep than the rest of the country. And this is due to the long history of the band rep program in Ontario and a human rights tribunal order that we'll talk about in just a moment. So if you're looking through the agreement, make sure you're looking for the Ontario specific provisions on band rep or First Nation representative services. So in 2018, during that phase of orders before negotiations began, the Human Rights Tribunal ordered Canada to fund the actual costs of band rep services in Ontario. Canada complied with this, and they began providing funding at actuals to First Nations in Ontario for band rep services. In 2022, so following the signing of the AIP, Canada began providing band rep allocations. So they would send communities an allocation at the beginning of the year. And those allocations were the highest of either the highest annual amount that First Nation claimed through actuals, a per capita rate, which I believe in 22-23 was around $360 per person, or if neither of those gets you to $75,000, the $75,000 base. First Nations in Ontario still have and did then have access to actuals if they expended that allocation. And that will continue until March 31st, 2025. Currently, and since 2022, that funding has not been adjusted for remoteness in any way. In the agreement, beginning April 1st, 2025, a First Nations band rep funding would be their highest annual funding amount from 2019-2020 until 2022-2023, adjusted annually for inflation and a full RQ adjustment. So this is a change from what was presented for the chiefs who are on the call at the May Special Chiefs Assembly. So maybe just take a look at this specific section of the agreement. And I'll hand this back over to Megan. Do you need to be unmuted, Megan?
I am already on, thank you. As I had mentioned, one of the major gains of the agreement is the remoteness adjustment. And I've given you the number a couple of times now, but it bears repeating: a noun-wide average remoteness quotient adjustment of 101%. So that adjustment will be applied to prevention, band rep services, post-majority support services, IT, results, emergency, and household supports funding. And so whatever the number is, you can expect an adjustment depending on the location of your community to a NAN-wide average of 101%. What this represents is an estimate of the increased costs associated with remoteness will be applied to adjust the funding to account for those increased costs that you all have borne without being recompensed for them. And it's noted here that there is a very small adjustment proposed. And so you see the gains that were made by NAN's contributions to entering the agreement, to entering the tribunal case, and then to negotiating the agreement to see this full implementation happen.
Perfect. So I wanted to draw attention to, if the agreement were to be approved, just want to make sure everyone's aware of this, that the funding processes that Canada currently provides will end as of April 1st, 2025. So the below. So agency costs for intake and investigation, legal fees and building repairs, that would cease and be replaced with the baseline funding. Actuals for post-majority support services would end and be replaced with the post-majority funding formula contemplated in the agreement. Band rep services in Ontario, the actuals processes, if you expend your funding, would end, be replaced with the allocation adjusted for remoteness. And capital for FNCFS purposes, that would end at actuals and would be replaced by the capital process in the agreement. I'll highlight that there is also, the way the capital actuals currently work, there's capital for the program and there's capital for Jordan's principal. The current capital process for Jordan's principal would be unaffected by this, and it would continue as is until that's settled. So the deadline to submit claims for 24-25 would be September 20th, 2025. So in some of the non-monetary parts of the agreement helps to improve accountability from agencies to the First Nations that they serve. And among other things, it's to help ensure that First Nations and agencies are able to work together productively and really understand their own roles and responsibilities, especially with all these new structures and fundings in place. So agencies will be required to co-develop with their affiliated First Nations multi-year child and community well-being plans. And what those plans will incorporate is priorities of the First Nations affiliated with those agencies, mechanisms to facilitate information sharing between the agency and the First Nation, an integrated approach to service delivery, so how they're going to work together with their respective roles in the delivery of child and family services, and requirements for agencies to report to their affiliated First Nations. So First Nations know that the things in this plan are being done, being executed. Agencies will also collect data and report to First Nations on community well-being indicators. So NAN's ongoing role in reform. So as Megan spoke about before, there are all these new committees and structures that will come out of this agreement. So there's the Reform Implementation Committee, which essentially guides the implementation of the program over the 10-year term. Nan has three seats on that committee to oversee, monitor, and make recommendations to Canada on how the program is being implemented, how it could be implemented better, and if it's working out as planned. There's then a national secretariat. So that would be a hub for the data that's being collected throughout the program and the dissemination of best practices. So that will also help in seeing how effective the program is when we see all that data. So NAN will be a member of the National Secretariat as well. Then we have the Remoteness Secretariat. So NAN, alongside the National Assembly of Remote Communities, would establish the Remoteness Secretariat, which would serve as a hub for remoteness research, data, and again, the dissemination of best practices. So the ongoing research that NAN has been a part of on remoteness, that could be done on a national scale. That can be done, there can be so many different avenues to explore, and the Remoteness Secretariat can help support that. Then the NAN Canada RQ table, which began in 2017 and has worked to develop the remoteness quotient adjustment factor that you see throughout this agreement, will continue. A NARC Canada remoteness table, so the National Assembly of Remote Communities Canada remoteness table, will be a national version of that. So NARC and Canada will work together to address remoteness issues at a national level. NAN, as a member of NARC, will also be part of that process. And finally, we have the 1965 agreement reform. So I wanted to speak a little bit about this, just in case people aren't super clear on what this is. So the 1965 agreement is a cost-sharing agreement between Canada and Ontario. It has Canada reimburse Ontario for extending some social services on reserve. So this includes social assistance like Ontario Works, childcare, homemaking, and child and family services. So you'll recall that the tribunal found that the 1965 agreement specifically was discriminatory and needed to be reformed. So that's a big reason why Ontario has such a large part in this agreement, because the way First Nations agencies are funded in Ontario is completely different than how they're funded anywhere else in the country. And that's because of the 1965 agreement. So during the tribunal process, it's always been known that the 1965 agreement must be reformed to satisfy the tribunal. However, it can't be reformed without the Government of Ontario coming to the table. So like I said before, it's been decided that NAN will have a seat alongside Chiefs of Ontario and Canada to negotiate with both governments to reform the 1965 agreement. However, this reform process, negotiation process, has not yet begun because we're still waiting on the Government of Ontario to come to the table prepared to renegotiate the agreement. So I hope that's a bit more clear on what the 1965 agreement is and what the process going forward will be. And then I'm going to hand it over to Megan to give you a bit of an analysis of what we can get between litigation at the tribunal and negotiating an agreement.
Thank you. So I said at the beginning, we were going to try our best to make the issues clear. We've got this incredibly detailed agreement. We're asking you to make a decision about it. We're trying to distill the information that you truly need. And so these slides are important for that reason, because when the litigation happened, the tribunal made certain findings and certain orders. And those findings and orders, findings meaning the what the tribunal found as a matter of fact, that discrimination had occurred, that it had occurred in these areas. And orders meaning what the tribunal wanted to see done about it, what the reforms were that from the tribunal stance needed to have happened to resolve that discrimination. So you have those things in hand. You have what the tribunal has found and the orders that it has made. But following the litigation, these negotiations we're talking about, and I mean with that, both the agreement in principle and the provisional and now the final settlement agreement, you made gains beyond what the tribunal found. You made gains beyond what was achieved through litigation. And so what these slides are intended to highlight in that first column there, litigation slash CHRT orders, that's what you have in hand. The second column over, these are the gains that you made on top of the litigation. And then the third column is the analysis. Now, in going through this, by no means am I trying to suggest this is a perfect agreement. In fact, there may be provisions in there that you don't like, that you don't want to live with, specific areas where you find the agreement is sorely lacking. However, as a global agreement, that's what these two slides are looking at. Not going provision by provision in our analysis, but looking at the litigation as a whole, as against the negotiations as a whole on the bigger, more general categories. Because it's only by approving the negotiated agreement do you get to keep it. Not meaning to say that, say you didn't approve this agreement, that Canada could revert back to discriminating against anyone. But there are gains that were made there above and beyond what you got through litigation. And so let's talk about them for a moment. In terms of the prevention funding, what you have in hand from the litigation, from the CHRT, is findings of discrimination and orders to reform the prevention funding. And the actual funding for agencies only from 2019-2020 to 21-2022. Through negotiation, you have a significant increase. You've got the partial RQ adjustment on the 2023-2024 dollars. And as Kennedy said, the full RQ adjustment would be coming. You've got adjustments for inflation, and you have an increase in the prevention funding. And this isn't a small increase, this is a significant increase of funding. And it's in a commitment that will last, as we've said, for many years. In terms of the post-majority support services funding, what you have in hand is a consent order to fund till March 31st, 2023, which I have to say is based off the agreement in principle negotiations. But what you got through the negotiation is something significantly greater. You have actuals funding for First Nations and agencies going from 2022, 2023 to 2024, 2025. You've got $1.9 billion for First Nations for the next 10 years, and you've got your full RQ adjustment from 2025 forward. So again, you've got negotiation securing significant new funding commitments. And this is without findings of discrimination, meaning that there wasn't a finding at the tribunal that there was discrimination in the post-majority support services funding. And yet, through negotiation, these significant new funding commitments occurred. Moving to the next slide. Under the domain of housing, there were findings at the CHRT of discrimination based on safe and suitable housing, but there was no orders. This happens sometimes. You have a finding of discrimination, but a specific order isn't made to address the remedy for that, how to fix that. However, the remedy came through the negotiation, 2.0 billion for First Nations over 5 years between 2023 and 2028. And so that's a significant new funding commitment, again, without any order having been made to negotiate this particular issue. The RQ adjustments, as I said, this is a significant gain. So we did have findings of discrimination based on remoteness and orders to reform the funding formulas. But the gains that were made in terms of the exact RQ adjustment, which would be made, the partial between 2023 and 2024, and then the full at 2025, 2026. Those gains, again, were secured through new negotiation. And so this new bar that we have for accounting for remoteness comes from the negotiation and those commitments that were secured in that process. And then finally, the other reforms that were made that were mentioned, the agency accountability, the Reform Implementation Committee, the Dispute Resolution Tribunal, the Secretariat's remoteness table, all of these structural reforms above and beyond the increased funding, all of those tables and oversight mechanisms and so forth put in place come from the negotiations. Could you go to the next slide, please, David? So I mean, I think that the overall message that you can draw from this is that litigation gets you so far. It gets you to the point where you can have the other side at the bargaining table, but in terms of the specific gains that were made, those can't be won in court. The other thing we have here is all bets are off when the government changes, meaning this agreement is a certain thing now, but the probability of reaching a better deal with a different government or reaching a better deal by waiting further, by negotiating any longer, is fairly low. Here, what we have is the $47.8 billion for 10 years. And so what I'd encourage you to think about as you're reviewing the terms of the FSA is the likelihood of doing better in the short term, in the medium term, in the long term, and whether or not the drawbacks of the FSA outweigh the gains that were made through the negotiation process. And I believe, there we go. I'll leave Kennedy to review the next steps with you.
Great. So we'll just reiterate what we spoke about at the beginning, that NAN, COO, and AFN will all be doing engagements over the next number of weeks, with NAN's culminating in the August 28th Special Chiefs Assembly, COO's in that 10th and 11th Virtual Special Chiefs Assembly, and AFN 17th to 19th Special Chiefs Assembly in Winnipeg. So the next time we'll see you all will be Thursday, August 1st, same time, 10 a.m., 9 a.m. Central. And that's when we'll be answering the questions that we received today in the chat, any questions that come to us this week via the website link. And so I hope you can all come back and hear the answers to some of those questions. And that will lead us then into our next information session, just like this one, on August 19th. And then our second Q&A session on August 22nd. So I want to thank you all so much. I know this was a lot of information and a lot of me talking, and I apologize for that. So I hope that on Thursday we get to just answer your questions and have more of a dialogue. So I just want to thank you all again, and I'll pass it back over to Deputy Grand Chief Narcisse to say some closing comments.
Okay, thank you very much, Kennedy and Megan and everyone that was here today joining us regarding the information session on the final settlement agreement. I've been making some notes as well in terms of all the presentation that's happening. And I hope this is I know this is our initial step and initial meeting to discuss the FSA. Like Kennedy said, we are holding a town hall Q&A on Thursday, starting at 10 a.m. Eastern, 9 Central. So if you missed this portion of it, it's going to be also available for recording. And so, yeah, there's the engagement sessions as well on your screen. So like I said, the next one is August 1st at 10 a.m., 9 a.m. Central. And also we'll have another session, number 2, just regarding information on the final settlement agreement on August 19th. That's at 10 a.m. and at 9 a.m. Central. And also that'll be followed up with another question and answer period for August 22nd at 10 a.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Central. Also culminating in the NAN process with the final settlement agreement, a special Chiefs Assembly for Anishinaabe Nation. That's going to be virtual on August 28th, 2024 at 10 a.m. Eastern as well. So that concludes our presentation for today. Please get those questions in. Please join us this Thursday. And this is very important work, a lot of information, a lot of significant changes will be coming as a result if this FSA is passed by the Chiefs in Assembly as well. We think that there are some monumental gains that are attributed to remoteness, since this has never been before, where the culminating work that we've been doing with respect to establishing the remoteness quotient will be applied to many of these areas that we were just talking about as well. So with that, I'd like to thank you for coming out today, and I'd like to invite Stella to close us off with a closing prayer. Stella?
Okay. I'm just going to say the closing prayer, and hope everybody has a wonderful day and a wonderful week. For Moose Cree First Nation, we are going to be having our gathering of our people this week, and we look forward to seeing our people come home for the week. So it's going to be an exciting week for us here in Moose Cree First Nation, and I hope some of you are able to join us. So with that, I'll close with the prayer. Kinenaskum dink shemendo. Igibech miliakum magagishagak. Koyaspu gejnagastaya kuhi yokanaga bechapanga deki washishagoche. Nagadeliman nagamuma enagastayak matsuan. Koyaskanagastayak. Pejwichinan maganesta kenagastayak koyask nipi yagamaga aski. Koyasku gejipmatriakan maguche. Nagadelimanan koyask kenagadelamahayak. Kainaki kamadealami kuchikup matsuno kemiskaki bilomatsuan. Kinan askum dimistahi shemento ebejimilia kumagagishaga. Thank you, Creator, for this beautiful day. Thank you.
Miigwech, Stella, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And this concludes our information session for today. We look forward to seeing you again on Thursday for the Q&A. Enjoy the rest of your day, and miigwech.